Still some good seats in front. You can all gather here. Okay, want to introduce from Dallas, Debra Shinder. She's with TAC team and be covering cybercrime. So all you cyber criminals out there, pay attention and take notes. Anyway, let's give a warm welcome for Debra.
Thank you. I'm glad to see so many of you are still here. I know we're winding down to the end here, and I'm not sure whether they put me at the end so that I could finish things with a bang, or if there was maybe a less complimentary purpose in that, but I'm going to take it the right way, I think. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about cybercrime, as you probably already know, since you can read and since you've read the schedule, and I hope that those of you who are out here are interested in that aspect of technology. I've been an IT professional full-time for the last 8 years or so, but in my prior life, I was on the other side, so to speak. I have about 10 years experience as a police officer, police sergeant, police academy instructor, and college criminal justice instructor. And at the time I was working in police work, there really was not a lot of attention or a lot of focus on cybercrime because there weren't that many people on the internet other than the real techies, the university people, and the government, of course. And now it's becoming a growing problem, and it's one that we all have to address, I think. I've got some tough acts to follow here. There have been some really good talks, and some of them from the aspect or from the perspective of other people who work in law enforcement, but primarily at the federal level. And what I'm going to be addressing here today is more how to work with law enforcement officers at the local, the municipal and county level, and the state levels. Because in a lot of cases, that's going to be at least your first contact if you're a victim of cybercrime, or if you're a cyber criminal. I know there aren't any of those out here. Because there simply are not enough resources for the federal agencies to handle everything. And if you have a really big case where there's a large monetary loss, or you have a case where there's a terrorist suspect or something of that nature, of course, the FBI is going to be interested. But what happens in the real world is if you have a small loss, if you're a victim of internet fraud, or you're a victim of some type of the many cybercrimes that we'll discuss today, and there's nothing really high profile about it, the FBI doesn't have the time and the resources to give their full attention to that, because they have very, very important things to be focusing on, such as catching the terrorists and such as dealing with the criminals who are causing huge billion-dollar losses. So your local law enforcement agencies, in some cases, will have the jurisdiction over these types of small crimes. And unfortunately, law enforcement at the local and state level is just now beginning to try to catch up in terms of technology. 10 years ago, when I was still working in law enforcement, there were still lots of municipal police agencies that barely were computerized themselves. Actually, there were some small rural agencies that weren't computerized. Their officers did all their reports by hand. They filled out the UCR reports by hand and sent them in to the FBI. And there really was nobody on the staff or on the force who had any kind of expertise in terms of technology. Now, larger agencies, big cities, state agencies are playing catch up and are, some of them, coming up to speed pretty quickly. Small town agencies are still having a hard time, and still in a lot of cases don't really have anybody who has any idea how to preserve digital evidence. The technology investigator often is the guy or the gal on the department who knows the most about computers. Well, that's a relative thing. In a lot of cases, that means that that person knows how to install a program and nobody else does. That person knows how to format a floppy disk and nobody else there does. So that's your expert in the department. And this is a real problem, and becoming a real problem as cybercrime becomes more common and affects more people in the community, more ordinary people. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Do we have any other cops out there in the audience? We have one person who will admit to that. Any former cops? Anybody who used to be in law enforcement? One, okay. Two. So all the rest of you are undercover cops, right? One characteristic of being a cop or having been a cop is a little touch of paranoia, so that's what I think here. Most of you, I assume, are techies, right? How many of you are IT people? Ah, lots more hands now. So I'm going to be talking to you today about how you can work with these three cops in the audience and the rest of the police officers and other law enforcement officers that you may encounter in the courses of your jobs or even as citizens. Most of you probably use the net a lot at home as well, and you might become, hopefully you won't, but might become a victim, or the neighbors are going to come to you if they become a victim of this kind of crime because they know that you understand technology, so you know what to tell them here. Okay. I love it when my mouse goes to sleep. That means I talked too long, right? Okay, I know the first step here is establishing the credentials. Who is this woman? Why should we want to listen to her? You all have this in your big fat red book, so I'm not going to go through it here, but just to say that I do have, I think, a sort of a unique perspective, or a sort of unusual perspective, in that I have worked on both sides of the street here and do have some experience both in law enforcement and in technology. It seems to me that we have a case where we have two groups of people who each have one piece of the puzzle in terms of fighting cybercrime effectively. You IT people understand the technology, but a lot of IT people don't really know much about the law or about the protocols, not in a technical sense, but in a sense of the rules and the procedures that are followed that are involved in enforcing the laws. On the other hand, police officers know or should know the law, but oftentimes don't really understand the technology. And it's difficult to enforce laws that deal with acts that you don't understand or that you can't really define. So working together, I think you guys can work together with law enforcement, because you're going to have to take the first step. Most law enforcement officers are somewhat insular. It's a closed community. They're not especially trusting of so-called outsiders. So we're going to talk a little bit today and tell a few of the secrets of law enforcement officers for your benefit, so that you know a little bit more how to deal with them and how to communicate with them. My most recent book, Scene of the Cybercrime, deals with everything that I'm going to talk about today and more. And in writing it, this was the most fun book I've ever written. I've written about 4 books myself and contributed to over 15 others in the technology area. But this is the first one where I really got to use my former law enforcement experience as well. And it was really fascinating to research and write this book. And you're all welcome to buy it, of course. But this is not a sales pitch. These are the things that I'm going to talk about today. Try to address this. You notice this is going to be a long talk. I think I have like one of the longest scheduled allotments of time, and I think I can fill it, but if you all start getting really, really hungry or really desperate for coffee, you know, throw something up here. I do get hints very well. I can get the hint, and I'll try to speed it up. But we're going to discuss what cybercrime is, because it's a new term that's not in many dictionaries, even online dictionaries, and whether it really is a problem and how much of a problem it is. We're going to talk about the cybercriminals. I know, again, that none of you would be cybercriminals, but you probably know some people who might tend toward that. So we're going to talk about different motivations for committing different types of cybercrimes, and how criminal profiling can be used to help to track those down. We're going to talk about why you should want to help law enforcement officials to catch the cybercriminals. You know, I know that in a group like this, in a conference that's devoted to hacker-type topics, there are probably a lot of people out there who have at least a little bit of sympathy for some of the cybercriminals, at least. We'll see that there are lots of different categories of cybercriminals. They're not all created equal. But you may wonder, why should you get involved? Why should you want to help? We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the Great Governmental Divide, and what I mean by that is the attitude, I guess you'd say, of law enforcement officials that prevents them from working with not just IT people, but civilians, as we call them in general, or citizens, people who aren't part of law enforcement. And we'll talk about what you can do to help overcome that. How tech people can help to start to build a bridge. And of course, it's a two-way street. And then we'll talk a little bit about how a cybercrime case is actually built, the steps in collecting, preserving evidence, the steps involved in bringing that case to trial. You might be, in some cases, a witness, an actual witness to what happened in a particular case, if you're the network administrator in a company that was victimized by an intruder, or something of that nature. Or you might be called upon to be an expert witness, somebody who has no first-hand knowledge of this case, but who's qualified to give your opinion in court. So we'll talk a little bit about that. It's a lot of ground to cover. So I'm going to be maybe going a little fast throughout here. If you just absolutely are compelled to ask a question during the presentation, that's fine. I'll recognize you. If I don't see you, you know, jump up and down and wave or something like that. But it may be more efficient to wait until the end, because that way I'll probably give more time to answering your question, due to the fact that I won't be sitting here worried about, am I going to finish all this? So we can do it either way. In discussing cybercrime, the first element of that, or the first part of that word, you know what we mean. We're talking about cyberspace. We're talking about the network. When we talk about crime, we need to realize that a lot of people who aren't in law enforcement or who aren't attorneys don't really understand the difference between criminal law and civil law. So you hear all the time people saying something is illegal, and to a lot of people what that conjures up is you can be put in jail for it. There are two different systems of law in the United States that deal with two different purposes, really. The purpose of criminal law is to protect society, whereas the purpose of criminal law, of civil law, is to settle disputes, private disputes between individuals, or between a company and an individual, or two companies, two parties or entities. So I'm going to be talking about cybercrime. I'm going to be talking about criminal law, which is what law enforcement officers deal with. Most law enforcement officers, and certainly at the local and state level, don't deal with civil law. They don't have the authority to enforce civil law, a civil contract. So there are some differences. And it's also important to understand that the same act can be both a criminal offense, a crime, and a tort, or a civil wrong. So a person could be charged with murder, for instance, and even if they were acquitted of that charge, could still be sued in civil court for wrongful death. And that's happened in a lot of high-profile cases. It's not double jeopardy because we're looking at two totally different systems of law. We also always, when we're talking about enforcing laws and enforcing criminal law, we have to deal with how to legally collect evidence, how to legally make an arrest, how to legally seize property or search a location or search a computer for that matter. And we get into the area of constitutional protections, Fourth Amendment protections, Sixth Amendment protections. And a lot of people also don't understand where and when these apply. The constitutional protections apply to law enforcement officers. Now, there may be statutes, there may be statutory law that prevents you as a private citizen, privacy laws and so forth, from invading somebody's privacy. But I've heard people say, my employer violated my constitutional rights by searching my desk. Okay, that's not a constitutional issue, because that employer, number one, is not an agent of the government. And we're talking about agents of the government who don't necessarily have to be employed by the government. If you're acting at the behest of a government official, you may also be considered an agent of the government. But we're talking about a situation where the employer also has the right, as the employer and the owner of that desk, to conduct that search. So that's something that may come up sometimes. There used to be a very clear distinction, very big dividing line between civil and criminal law. That line is getting blurred today as statutes are passed, criminal statutes are passed, making things that used to be only civil matters crimes. So some things that once you could sue for, but you couldn't charge someone with criminally, now are becoming crimes. The law is always changing. You guys are used to changes in the IT industry because you know that the technology is always changing, the hardware is always changing, the software is always changing. Law enforcement officers also deal with that same kind of thing in that the laws are always changing. So it's difficult to keep up with sometimes. A breach of contract, if you have a contract with someone, that normally would not be a criminal matter. Somebody breached the contract that you had, you take them to civil court and sue them for monetary damages. But in some cases now, things that used to be a breach of contract are being enacted into law as crimes. So that becomes a sort of a double-edged sword there. What is cybercrime? Well, we're going to define cybercrime today, and there's no really official definition. The UN has its definitions of cybercrime. The FBI has its definitions of cybercrime, computer crime. But we're going to talk about cybercrime in a broad sense, and we're going to say that it's any illegal act that's committed using a computer network. Not just using a computer, because if it's a standalone system, then and you for instance, store records on that system that pertain to your illegal drug trade or your illegal gambling business or whatever. That's not a cybercrime because there's no communication going across the network. Cybercrime is a subset of computer crime. It's a type of computer crime. Again, what we mean by illegal here is something that's a violation of criminal law. Something that's a violation of the state penal code, or something that's a violation of city or county ordinances that are created outlawing something, making it criminally illegal, making it a criminal offense. We're not talking about civil matters. Who are these cyber criminals? Well, There's no way that you can profile the typical cyber criminal because they come with lots of different faces, they have lots of different motives. It's like trying to define who are criminals. You have white-collar criminals, you have violent criminals, you have sexually motivated criminals, and on and on and on. So we can categorize our cyber criminals to a degree, and we can use profiling in a more narrow sense applied to those categories. We can't create an overall profile of a cyber criminal. What we need to understand is that we're not just talking about hackers. That's probably what most people think of when you say cyber criminal, but that's only a small, really small proportion of the people who commit illegal acts using the internet or using a network. We have people who use the internet as a tool of the crime. They use it to commit the crime, just like a pry bar could be a tool of the burglary crime because the criminal used it to break into the house. In this case, the computer and the internet are tools of the crime. Here we're talking about white-collar criminals, people who use the network to maybe transfer money from other people's accounts into their own accounts, embezzlers if they're working within the company. We're talking about computer con artists. This is a really big and growing problem, and that encompasses a lot of different scams and different con games, and I'll bet there's nobody in this room who's never gotten, say, the Nigerian letter or gotten some sort of email that's trying to get you to invest in this wonderful business opportunity, or who hasn't seen a website that tries to convince you to send money for something that you may get nothing for. This includes things like web cramming, where you're offered web hosting services or some sort of online service that you pay for, or even better, that you get a free trial. And then if you want to continue the service afterward, your credit card will be billed. Yeah, right. If you don't want to continue the service afterward, your credit card often gets billed too for months and months and years. So lots of con games. And these are things that have been around in a lot of cases forever. The Nigerian letter that's so popular online, I remember back in, I think about 1993 or so, seeing that same letter sent to my husband, who's a doctor, and so considered a good target for things like that, through the postal mail. So this is a case of just taking the same old stuff and porting it to a newer, better, more efficient way of reaching more marks or more victims. So con artists, hackers, crackers, and network attackers, of course, that's a totally different type of cyber criminal. These are people who usually have some technical expertise, although we have script kiddies and click kiddies who don't necessarily have to have a lot of technical expertise in order to commit these attacks. But the motive is different for all of these different categories. All of these people in this category, though, are using the internet and the computer as a tool of the crime. We also have people who use the computer and net incidentally to the crime. They could commit the crime without the net fairly easily, but they use the net and the computer to keep their records of their illegal business or things like that. They use email or they use chat to correspond with accomplices, to help plan their crimes, to talk about their activities. They're not really using it to commit the crime. We also have what I call accidental cyber criminals here, and I'm talking here about people who might commit an act that is against the law, but they didn't really mean to. Yeah, right, that's what they all say, right? That's what I always say, no. People who, because of their ignorance of the technology or because of their ignorance of the law, I'm sure you've encountered lots of folks who know just enough about computers and the net to be dangerous. So they're just playing around. They're trying to learn, right? They stumble across somebody's network that's wide open. And, oh, look at that neat folder there. I think I'll see what's in it. And they may not even, in some cases, realize if they're on a shared network, a cable modem network or something like that, may not even know enough to realize that this is not something on their own computer. And so if your state has a law that makes unauthorized access to a computer network a crime, then they may technically have committed a crime by invading that network without knowing that they did or without really realizing what they're doing. Now, we always say ignorance of the law is no excuse, right? Right? So we're going to throw them in the slammer too, right? Maybe, maybe not. Probably not. Because in most instances, in terms of state statutes, the penal codes in most states, you're required to meet a certain level of mental culpability in order for an act to be an offense. So the same act can be a crime or can be a different crime depending on what your mental state is when you commit that act. So, for instance, taking it away from the cyber realm for a second and putting it into terms that are real easy to illustrate, the act of killing another person, is that a criminal offense? Usually, depending on what your mental state is, if you intend to kill that person, you see Joe out there and you don't like him and you hate him and you take a gun and you shoot him with the intent to kill him, that's murder, clear and simple. If you commit a reckless act, for instance, in most states, drunk driving, DWI, driving under the influence, it's called different things in different states, and you kill somebody. In some states that's considered murder too, but in most, it's considered either a lower degree of murder or it's considered manslaughter because your mental state was different, because you didn't have the intent to kill Joe. That wasn't what you set out to do. But you did commit an act that was reckless, that was irresponsible, and that resulted in Joe's death. Joe's just as dead either way, but in terms of what happens to the person who committed the act, it does make a difference. Now, there are other situations where it may not be a criminal offense at all. If your state has the death penalty and you are the executioner, killing that person by lethal injection or pulling the switch on the electric chair isn't obviously an offense. And if you kill someone in self-defense, somebody who's trying to kill you, then you may not be charged because you don't meet the culpable mental state required for an offense. You weren't negligent, you weren't reckless, you didn't do it intentionally and knowingly. You did it under the provisions of the law, which usually contain exceptions for self-defense. So that's what we were talking about, accidental cyber criminals. They may not be criminals at all, in that they may not meet the requirements for charging them with a crime because they didn't have the proper mental state. In other cases, a statute may be written without requiring any particular mental state, and then they could be charged. Another interesting aspect of cybercrime is the phenomenon of situational cyber criminals. And what I mean here by this is people who are upstanding citizens who would never think of doing anything illegal in the, quote, real world. And then they go online and suddenly the persona changes completely. This doesn't always go to the extreme degree of committing crime, but probably all of you who've spent some time online are familiar with this to some degree, how some people become very, very different online, how some people who are normally meek and mild in real life, they suddenly become obnoxious and overbearing in the online community. Well, that can be taken to an extreme in a case where people actually commit crimes. And why do they do that? Why is it so different? I think it's based on two things: the illusion, at least, of anonymity, thinking that nobody knows who I am, so I can do all these things that I've repressed all my life. I can be a bad guy and nobody will know. And the illusion of unreality, the feeling that these other people that you're dealing with are not really exactly real people because you've never met them in real life. You know, most of the people here who've been using the net for a long time probably don't feel that way, because your cyber life and your real world life are very much overlap. In a lot of cases, you may have met people here at this conference that you had known online for a long time, but you'd never met them in person. And now you meet them, and so you have experience with the fact that the people you communicate with online are real. But a lot of people who are new to the net still seem to act as if the people that they deal with online are maybe like sophisticated computer programs. Now, they're interacting with the computer. They don't realize there's a real person on the other end of that modem or the other end of that network line. So that's the situational cyber criminal. Who are the victims? Well, companies can be victimized and are victimized to a large extent. The Internet Fraud Complaint Center, which is an organization, cooperative effort between the FBI and the National White Collar Crime Center, in its first year of operation between 2000 and 2001, received over 30,000 complaints of online fraud, and only a very small proportion of the actual cases, of course, result in complaints to an organization like that. So there's a lot of money that's being lost out there. The Computer Security Institute's 2001 survey had only 186 respondents, companies that they surveyed, and out of that 186 respondents, they reported that there was about $3.5 million in losses to their companies based on online crime, primarily online theft of data or fraudulent activities. So companies stand to lose a lot, but a lot of companies, as you all know, because a lot of you probably work as consultants to these companies trying to get them to implement security measures, and so many of them won't do it. Why not? You know, they certainly, the people who make the decisions in these companies, if you tell them they ought to lock their doors at home at night or when they leave, they probably would. Why don't they implement the same kind of measures on their networks, especially when they stand to lose a lot more than they do at home? Well, I think in some cases it's ignorance. They don't understand the technology. They don't understand what security is, what it can and can't do. I think in more cases, it's a matter of the bottom liners, the people who are concerned about the money aspect. It costs too much to implement security. Anybody ever heard that one before? Yeah, probably a few of you. It costs a lot more if you're a victim, but we're all gamblers. We're in Las Vegas. Of course, we're all gamblers. So a lot of us have a tendency to want to gamble, and we have that psychological thing that says, well, those things happen to somebody else. They don't happen to me. So I'll just keep, you know, won't buy the insurance. I won't spend the money. If I have to spend money to protect myself against something that might not happen, well, that's like wasted money, right? And nobody wants to waste money. Oh, I forgot we're in Las Vegas. Of course we want to waste money. Most company financial officers don't want to waste money. So that's one of the reasons that people don't, or that companies don't implement security. Then we have individuals who are the victims of cybercrime. People who actually do send in their money in response to those con artists who tell them about this great work-at-home opportunity, use your computer to make $30,000 a month. You know, it's easy, I did it. Well, he did it, surely I can do it too. So sure, I'll send him the 25 bucks or the 200 bucks or whatever to get the kit, the magic kit, that'll tell me how to do this so I can retire and stay home all the time and make big bucks. These are usually people that are new to the net, that haven't seen these same things over and over and over 1,000 times. Or they're people who are just naturally naive. Very young people. The elderly are a favorite target of con artists, both online and offline. Lots of them really want to be helpful. They want to help people out, so they'll fall for sob stories. Or they need money for their retirement. You know, they're looking at all that money that they lost in the stock market this last year and looking for a quick way to replace that. So people who are natural targets, those individuals. Then we have our desperados, you know, the people who are looking for love in all the wrong cyberspaces, and not necessarily for love, but in some cases looking for money, and they're really desperate. And like the guy who lost his life savings in the stock market, you know, they're willing to take that chance because there's this hope. Hope springs eternal. This hope that there really will be the big payoff. We also have another category of cyber victims that I call pseudo-victims because they aren't really victims at all. People who report crimes who haven't really been victimized. Why would anybody do that? Just for the joy of going down to the police station and getting to interact with cops? Well, there may be a few cop groupies out there, but usually the motivation is different. Often the motivation is a desire for attention. You have people who really don't have enough to do and lead boring lives, I guess, and being a victim or being perceived as a victim of a crime gives them some attention from their families, from law enforcement, from other people in the community and so forth. So they report these crimes that weren't really committed. Then you have people who report crimes and pretend to be victims because there's something in it for them monetarily, because they're defrauding the insurance company or something of that nature. You also have people who pretend to be victims because they actually committed the crime. Now, that's a great cover. You do it, you go down and pretend that you were the victim of the offense. And we have people who really truly think they're victims, but they've been the victim of immoral or unethical behavior, but not the victim of a criminal offense. In order to have a criminal offense, you have to have a statute that makes that act illegal. And if there's not one, even though we always say there ought to be a law, just because there ought to be a law doesn't mean that we can charge you with an offense if there's not a law yet. A lot of the individuals who are victimized by cybercrime didn't really do anything wrong. They weren't particularly naive. They're not desperate for anything. They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And that's true of victims of all types of crimes. Another larger victim of this type of crime is society itself. And a smaller subset of that is the online society or the online community. And that's, even though it's not really a physical, geographic place, that is becoming a very real thing, the community of online people. So that's a victim, and we're going to talk later about why it's important that we work together to fight cybercrime in order to protect our online society. Who are the cyber investigators? Who are the people who enforce these laws and who build these cases to help enforce these laws? Well, IT professionals have a hand in that because in a lot of cases you're the first one who sees the evidence or who realizes that a crime is being committed. You have corporate security personnel who may become involved in the corporate environment. You have private investigators in some cases, not usually, but in some cases you may have people who hire private security, private investigators, and of course, law enforcement officials. The ultimate destination for the reporting of your cybercrime is law enforcement, because that's who has the authority to do something about it. That's who has the authority to put together the case, to take it to the district attorney or the county attorney, to actually get this person charged with an offense and get them into court so that they can be punished. All of these people have to work together in order for us to be able to fight cybercrime effectively. We also need to realize that just because a crime has been committed doesn't mean that it will be reported to the police. A lot of crime of all types is not ever reported. It's not always desirable to report it. You know, if somebody steals a nickel from you, you probably won't call the cops, even though it was a clear theft. They did it intentionally. They knew it was your nickel. They took it anyway. How many of you would call the police to report that? That's because you're all high-paid, rich IT pros, and a nickel doesn't mean anything to you, right? No, it's because there's a cost. You do a cost-benefits analysis, and you realize that your loss is very small compared to the inconvenience and the time and the hassle factor that would be involved in reporting it. Okay, that's one part. And then you also realize that what would the police do if you call them to report the theft of a nickel? They'd probably laugh. And they probably wouldn't come out and take a report or do anything unless you're in a really small town where they really don't have anything to do. So it's going to be a very minor misdemeanor offense. So it's not worth calling the police. And that may be true in some cases of some cyber crimes, some acts that would be considered cyber crimes. Somebody intrudes on your network, but as far as you can tell, they didn't really get it very far. They didn't see anything that was important, that was confidential. They didn't do any damage to the network. They didn't delete anything. They didn't plant any viruses and so forth. So what is your loss? Your loss is very small or not quantifiable at all. And if you went to law enforcement, first of all, it would take a lot of time, and there would be a lot of hassle involved, and secondly, they wouldn't do anything about it. What could they do about it? So you have to make that analysis as to when the police should and shouldn't be called in. Another question you're probably asking yourself here is, what's in it for me? Why should I get involved even if the case is of a more major nature and something that law enforcement would get involved in? Why should you cooperate with the police? They're the enemy, right? Well, hopefully not. But in a lot of cases, a lot of citizens who are not criminals, upstanding citizens like all of us, do consider the police to be at least adversaries. You know, we don't trust them any more than they trust us. And a lot of that is fed by media focus on bad police officers, on police brutality, on police incompetence, you know, and some of it's valid because there are bad police officers out there, and you don't hear about the good ones because that doesn't make a very good story. You know, police officer is not corrupt. Great headline. Found to be not corrupt. So we hear about the bad. And just like the police officers always deal with the bad segments of society, and they see so many people over and over who are really kind of at the bottom of the barrel in terms of society, they don't go see the guy who's sitting at home not committing crimes unless he's a victim, and in that case they're still focused on the criminal, not the victim. So they tend to think, Everybody who's not a cop is a suspect, right? And you have the same attitude back toward them. So are there any advantages in working with them to fight cybercrime? I see some people shaking your heads. No, I don't see what they are. Well, maybe there are. For one thing, the more the criminals get away with, the bolder they become, the more they will take over our online community, which used to be a really nice place to be, right? Remember back in the early 90s when not that many people were online. The ones who were on AOL over there in their separate network, and you didn't have to worry about them too much. But now there are a lot of people out there that are out to get something for themselves. And it's becoming much more unpleasant. And it will become much more unpleasant as this problem grows, and it will grow. Because the bigger any community gets, the more crime you have. That's just a historical fact. You have more anonymity, again, so the people who are inhibited by, in a small community, by the fact that everybody knows everybody, and if you're bad, everyone knows it, and the society sort of shuns you. They're not inhibited by that in a large community. You also just have a larger number of people, so there's a greater chance that any individual person will be a criminal. So they're taking over. Why are we letting them do that? We need to take back the networks just like citizens groups have determined to take back their neighborhoods in high crime areas. The internet is becoming a high crime neighborhood. What can we do about it? But if you don't have such noble aspirations to make our society better or our community better, what's in it for you personally? Like we said, there's a big monetary loss going on. If you're the IT professional in your company and your company becomes victimized by cyber criminals and you lose $2 million, the company loses $2 million. It doesn't come out of your pocket, so what do you care? Well, you may not have a job after a while if you're the person who's responsible for securing that network and you let these guys get through and you let this happen. Guess who's going to get the blame? Not the criminal, really, not within the company. It's going to be you. So there is something in it for you personally. There are also disadvantages, of course, in that you're going to have to learn a new language. You're going to have to learn to deal with people that you're not used to dealing with, and it may be uncomfortable to deal with people in positions of law enforcement authority. And we'll talk about why it's uncomfortable later. Do you have to cooperate with the police in investigating these offenses, these matters? Sometimes, that's right, it depends. It depends on what they're asking you to do, and it depends on what the offense is, and it depends on your role, what your role is. If you're just a witness, do you have to tell what you saw or observed or experienced? Well, if you get a subpoena, you do. If you ignore that subpoena, then you can be held in contempt of court, which is a criminal offense and which you can end up in jail for. So yes, sometimes you do have to cooperate whether you want to or not. In other cases, you may have the option. And in those cases, then you need to go back and think about what's in it for you in terms of cooperating and how much you cooperate. The Great Governmental Divide is my term for the problems that are caused by what I call the law enforcement culture. Police officers tend to congregate together to circle the wagons. We've talked about that a little bit before. They're in a kind of a world that's very different probably from your world in terms of how they work and where they work and the atmosphere there. You know, you go out every day wondering whether you're going to come home at night wondering whether you're going to be shot at because of the uniform that you're wearing and so forth and so on. That tends to make people not real happy-go-lucky. Maybe be able to understand that. And it's not just the danger, the physical danger, but it's also the, let's call it the operating environment in which they have to work. It's a very highly regulated, very highly structured environment. It's a paramilitary organization in most cases. The emphasis there is on para, however. There are big differences between law enforcement and the military, and those people who go from military to law enforcement work recognize this real quickly. Police officers wear uniforms like the military. They have the same kind of little, what we call fruit salad. They're little ribbons and commendations and things. They look like military. They stand up straight and salute the flag like military and so forth. But the organization is very different. And I think the biggest difference is in terms of the fact that a military unit usually has a very specific, very well-defined mission. And they train for that mission. They're highly trained. In police work, it differs from agency to agency, but in a lot of cases, you don't really have that well-defined mission. Your mission is to protect and serve. There's not much specificity in that. So police officers like to think of themselves as being military-like, but in a lot of ways they're not nearly as organized. Agencies are not nearly as structured, and there's certainly not the kind of standardization that there is in the military. There's a big difference between an LAPD officer and a Podunk, Oklahoma officer in terms of the environment that they work in. They're used to doing things by the book. You've dealt with bureaucracy, right? Ever? Never? Never had to? Please tell me how you managed not to. I'd love to know. And bureaucrats, which includes most government agents, are used to doing things by following the rules, whether the rules make sense or not, right? That's one of our big frustrations in dealing with the bureaucracy, is that it seems that common sense has no place. You just have to do it because that's the way we do it. And police are part of that structure. A lot of people see the police as having a lot of power, and that's normal because most police officers come on like gangbusters, and you know, they're wearing a gun. They have the authority to take lives in situations where citizens don't have that authority. So certainly that makes them seem very powerful. But what is power? How do we define power? In a lot of cases, power is just perception. It's perceived power, but there's a lot less power there than they really seem to have. And that's because police officers are weighted down by all the laws that govern their actions. They have to abide by all these very detailed, very, very minutely formulated legal restrictions. And they also they're governed by agency policies, which are even more restrictive than the laws, the state and federal laws that determine what they can or can't do. And then political factors come into play. You know, it would be nice in an ideal world if police officers and other government agents could just do what's right or just do what's legal. But you also have to consider, what does the city councilman want you to do? You know, what does the chief want you to do? Probably most people in here, anybody in here ever gotten a speeding ticket? Yeah? Speeding on the information superhighway. And I'm sure that you believe that the mayor's wife, if she drives the same speed that you did, on the same street that you did, at the same time that you did, should get a ticket too, shouldn't she? Sure, the laws should be applied equally. Are the laws always applied equally? We probably don't have anybody in here who's naive enough to believe that. There's always political pressure. The larger the organization, in some cases, the more of a buffer there is between officers on the street and that political pressure. But in other ways, there's more political pressure because there are more layers of politicians involved. Either way, there's always going to be politics involved in any government job, and police work is no exception to that rule. So there's a lot of pressure from that direction on the police officers. And then there's the public relations aspect. The media is often not kind to the police, often doesn't show the good side and shows only the bad side. So they're always kind of walking on eggshells. Is somebody videotaping this? And what will that videotape look like? You know, videotapes don't lie, right? Well, depends. If you see part of the story and not all of the story, the perception you get from that tape may be very different from the perception you would have if you were there on the scene and saw the whole thing. So there's a lot of paranoia there added to a personality type that is already inherently paranoid. So all this power, a lot of that's an illusion. In a lot of cases, officers are not nearly as confident as they seem to be. The ones who come on as the most overbearing are often the ones who are the least confident. They're trying to convince themselves. They're trying to take control so they won't have to deal with those things that make them feel less confident. Command presence is a required part of the job. That's what you're supposed to do, is go into a situation and take control. So police officers don't like not being in control. Most network administrators are control freaks too. Why else would you want to have control over what everybody on the network's doing? So maybe you can understand that part a little bit. Most cops feel pretty powerless in my experience, and I've known lots of cops. Even though I'm not one myself anymore, I still work with a lot of them and still deal with a lot of them, both in real life and on the net all over the country. And most of them feel very overworked, underpaid, overstressed, and really don't feel like these big bad cops that the persona that they have to project to the world. So in that way, I guess you can say that police officers are sort of like some of these people online, these meek, mild people who suddenly become mice who roar when they get online. Most cops don't understand technology. Now that's changing, and a lot of large agencies have developed high-tech crime units. Federal agencies like the FBI and so forth have some very, very well-trained and people who have a lot of expertise in this area. But when we're talking about the local level, in a lot of cases, a lot of the people don't have any understanding at all. If they were called in to investigate a network intrusion, they have no idea what the difference is between an intrusion and a denial of service attack. They have no idea what TCP/IP is. Well, that's a bunch of letters, right? So you've got people who are investigating crimes that they don't understand. They don't understand how the crime's committed. If we have a burglary offense and we say that somebody broke out a window and, say, in a French door, and turned the doorknob handle to get into the house, well, everybody understands what that means. But everybody doesn't understand the technology involved in a network intrusion. So it's very hard to even know whether you've got that offense or not, or what offense you've got if you don't understand the technology. But cops don't like not understanding something, because that makes you look less powerful and less authoritative. They don't like admitting to not understanding something. They certainly don't like asking someone else to explain something, unless it's, well, explain why you're out here at 3 a.m. in the morning. So So they're probably not going to come to you, or a lot of them aren't going to come to you and ask for help, ask for your expertise. And that's why you're going to have to take the first step in bridging that gap. This feeling of powerlessness underneath this requirement that you appear to be completely confident and in control leads to more than a little bit of paranoia. As we said before, a lot of cops have the attitude that everybody's out to get them. It's us versus them. There are police officers, there's the rest of the world. The rest of the world is the scumbags, you know, because that's who we deal with every day. When we deal with someone who's not a police officer, they're usually committing a crime. So naturally, we think that everybody, and some people who are police officers, are committing crimes. So we develop this attitude. There's a saying in police work, nobody loves a cop except another cop. And you tend to get very, very self-focused, and you tend to build this wall. They call it the blue wall of silence. Cops won't testify against other cops even when the other cops do bad things. Why? Because they're one of us and we have to protect each other. You know, it's an erroneous attitude, but it's also a very common one. The thin blue line refers to the line that a police officer has to walk in terms of making the right decisions, because you out there on the streets especially, you have to make decisions in a split second that can result in taking somebody's life or result in losing your own life. You make the wrong decision, the guys who judge you for that have plenty of time to analyze every action that you did, but you have to make the decision just like that. So all of this leads police officers to be very difficult to get to know and very difficult to work with in a lot of cases if you're considered an outsider. When a police department does decide to computerize their operations or to upgrade their software that they use for records management and things like that, the guy who comes in or the gal who comes in, the tech person who comes in to do that, is regarded as an outsider. They don't understand what we're doing here because they're not cops. How could they possibly understand? There is this feeling that nobody understands any aspect of your job unless they've walked a mile or more in your shoes. That's something you have to overcome in dealing with law enforcement. One of the best kept secrets about police officers is that they are human beings, though. There is a real person inside, underneath that thick, hard shell, usually. Maybe not in every single incident, but usually there's a real person there. And if you can break through to that real person by being a professional, by acting objective, by not being condescending just because you know something that they don't, you have some expertise that they don't, but also not being fearful, not being afraid of them and afraid to say anything. If you treat them with respect as equals and not as subordinates and not as someone who's intellectually superior, even though you may be, probably I would say the average IQ of the average IT professional is higher than that of the average cop. But they have an area of expertise, you have an area of expertise. Those two areas need to be combined for this common goal of fighting cybercrime. There are lots of reasons that cops and techies don't get along. Any of you techies have good friends who are cops? We do have a few. Great. You have overcome those barriers, or maybe you knew them before they became cops. That's the easy way to do it. But there are usually a lot of lifestyle differences. One of the big differences is money. Now, the bottom has dropped out of the dot-com bubble, and so tech people are maybe not quite as well off as they used to be. So the tech lifestyle has come down a notch from the ridiculous to the merely sublime, at least as compared to the typical cop lifestyle. You know, the typical guy on the street is out there trying to support his 2.5 kids and his wife, well, his wife and his 4 ex-wives, because divorce runs rampant in law enforcement, trying to buy a house and trying to get by, usually working off-duty jobs after his regular shift in order to do that. And nobody goes into police work because it pays well. They have to be nuts. No, they have to be really dedicated to go into that in the first place. So he sees you guys sitting there doing this really easy thing, sitting at this computer, tapping away all day, you know, ordering in pizza, having all this fun, and making the big bucks. Well, that's going to cause maybe a little bit of resentment and jealousy, and it's certainly going to cause a lack of understanding between the two. There's a little bit of an elitist mentality on both sides, I think, and that's because cops feel that they know something that technical people don't. You know, they have the guns, they know the law. Tech people feel that they know something that cops don't because they know computers, they know this really complex field of expertise. So there's a little bit of that on both sides. There's an adversarial relationship in some cases because tech people at least a little bit admire a good hack, you know? Even if it were against your network, if somebody did it and they did it well, you have to kind of admire that technically, even though you're the victim. Law enforcement people just see it as a crime. That was against the law. That's a crime. So that's a bad guy. All bad. Law enforcement people tend to see things in terms of black and white. And no gray area in between. They don't understand the difference between a white hat hacker and a black hat hacker. And they certainly don't understand the concept of a gray hat who's somewhere in between that. It's human nature to protect your own, and that comes in on both sides of the equation. However, you do have some things in common. You do both work long, odd hours. Who except a cop or a programmer are you going to find up at 3 in the morning working away and enjoying it? You know, so that's one common thing. Caffeine addiction. Now you might argue about the merits of Jolt Cola versus thick black station house coffee, but either way it's caffeine. That's common to both. A dedication to your job. There are people who get into IT for the money, but I think the people who do it for that reason generally discover that it's not really worth it if that's the only reason you're in it. Most IT people get into it because they love working with computers. They enjoy it, they're dedicated. And most cops get into it because they really do want to make a difference. They really do want to help people. You know, a lot of them lose that over the years. They become cynical. But most of them do initially get into it for that reason. Both of you want things to make sense. You know, you want your code to make sense. You want it to work right. Cops want the law to make sense. They want the bad guys to be brought to justice. They want things to be fair. And you're both problem solvers by nature. That's what your job is about, solving problems. As a techie, it's about solving problems, how to make one computer communicate with another computer, how to resolve names, how to secure your network. You're always looking at problems and figuring out how to solve them. Police officers are always trying to solve problems like how to get this husband and wife to stop fighting and calling them out to referee their domestic disputes. You know, how to prevent the rise in burglaries in a particular neighborhood, things like that. Problem-solving skills are universal, even though the problems themselves may be very different. So you have that in common. What can you do to solve the problem of how to work with law enforcement officers? You can take the first step toward doing that, and you can do that by treating law enforcement officers as professionals when you report a crime to them or when they come to you in the process of investigating a crime. Like I said before, treat them as equals and act professionally and get to know them as people. It's sometimes hard, but there are benefits to you in having a good friend who's a cop, right? You guys who have friends who are cops, there are some benefits there, both tangible and intangible. I've got several more slides to go here, but I've been told that the time is about up. Time really flies when you're having fun, and I've been having a lot of fun with you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here, but I will take questions if somebody doesn't come, and knock the door down saying we need this table right now. And if they do, we can move out to the hall, and I'll be glad to answer any of your questions there. I have some cards up here if anybody's interested. I have one copy of the book, but they have copies out there at the bookstore. And I want to real quickly, let's see, click through here to a little information. There's a lot of stuff left there. That's the book. The website, come visit me on the web. www.sceneofthecybercrime.com. If you want to know more than you ever wanted to know about me personally, www.shindernet is my family website. And feel free to email me at dshinder@sceneofthecybercrime.com, and I'll try to answer any of your questions. I've enjoyed it.
Debra, you might mention, I don't know how many people are aware, but I'm sure you are, about the organization Integral
Yes.
chapters across the United States. That it's a really good source of information, especially since each chapter has to have an FBI agent.
That's correct. The FBI does act as a kind of liaison there. InfraGard is an organization that you may want to check out. And I don't have, I assume it's probably at www.infragard.com. Is it com or? It's gov, okay. I thought www.infragard.gov. And there are lots of resources on my website that I gave you the URL for previously. There are lots of resources of organizations that can help you to work with law enforcement.
Just one quick question. At what point does a scan or something like that become an invasion of network and publicly considered illegal?
Right now, there's not a clear-cut answer to that because it depends on your state. In terms of federal law, it's not absolutely illegal. Some state laws do make it illegal to just do a port scan even though you don't actually enter the network, but it would have to be specified in the statute itself. It's sort of like somebody who is in an apartment complex and goes around and tries the doors to see if any of the doors are unlocked, but they don't go in. They're just seeing if they're unlocked. There's nothing the cops can really do about that because they're in a public place. Now, if somebody comes up on your property, you own a house, and that's all your property, and they come up on your property, then you may be able to charge them with trespass. But the person who's doing the scan is in a public place. The internet is a public place. So they're not trespassing yet. It's like a pre-criminal activity. So it is if your state statute says it is. Otherwise, it's not.
I read on CNN where that the father got cat in the hospital or something like that. And I thought it was incidental loss of life. And you like get the death penalty, you go to jail for the rest of your life.
If you hacked the hospital and you hacked into, say,
Like the test database and change the sodium value.
or change the medication somebody's supposed to get. I'd say you were at least reckless and could be charged with manslaughter, which could put you away for a good 20 years. Could you be put to death, the death penalty? Well, again, we're talking about state statutes. Most penal statutes are state statutes. Most of these things are not federal crimes per se, unless they involve a government computer, unless they involve a computer in the banking system, and that kind of thing. So we're...
I just want to correct that. That's not true at all. Any system used in interstate communication or commerce is protected under the federal statute.
Well,
It's really quite broad. It's not just limited to banks and a government computer.
I was going to get to interstate commerce, but thanks. Because it would depend on whether that system is local, you know, whether you've gone across state lines and so forth and so on too. In terms of the state statutes that you could be charged with, that would be manslaughter in most states. Yes?
Do you see a new profession evolving in law enforcement?
Good question. Yes?
One slide you get to was talking about whether or not if somebody wanted to use you as a subject matter expert. Touched a little bit upon the pitfalls of that, or what you should look for if somebody approaches you.
What you should look for as a subject matter expert, or what they're looking for in you.
What to do not to put yourself in jeopardy if you're going to try and help somebody out.
In terms of liability.
Liability or, yeah.
Yeah. Well, first you need to actually be an expert in that subject matter. In some countries, you have to be registered as an expert in order to be qualified to testify in court as an expert witness. In the U.S., the judge qualifies you based on your credentials, based on your degrees that you have, based on your experience in the field, based on other cases that you may have testified in, how many of those and what type, based on just the totality of your expertise. It's sort of like, what would you put on your resume? That's how you build your credibility, and the judge determines whether, in that specific case, whether you're qualified to testify as an expert. In terms of protecting yourself, what you're doing, what an expert witness can do that an evidentiary witness can't do, is give your opinion. So you are stating an opinion, and in that aspect you have a little bit more protection, because your opinion can't be perjury, right? If you state something as a fact and it's not true, then it's perjury, but your opinion is your opinion. And you'll see in most criminal cases and civil cases that you have experts on both sides often. You have a defense expert who testifies to one opinion, and then you have someone on the prosecution side whose opinion is entirely the opposite. Okay, neither one of those is liable. Well, now you can be sued civilly for anything. Anybody can sue you for anything. But in terms of perjury or criminal liability, you're giving your opinion, so you're pretty safe. Anybody else? Or yes?
I was going to make a comment on that. One of the things you're going to be an expert witness, for example. Typically, you want to be retained by an attorney or a law firm.
Right.
Directed by the corporate IT people on that gap.
Yeah, that's almost always the way that it would work. And you do get paid usually as an expert witness, and sometimes quite well. Usually a per diem, plus your expenses are paid if you have to travel.
Well, the point I wanted to make there is that if you're retained by the attorney, then the product of your work and all of everything else becomes protected by client privilege. So that does afford you, in the discussion of the case, you'll be talking about a lot of things.
Right.
So that does afford you some confidentiality
That's right. Another side of that to be aware of is that if you use your notes in court to testify, then those become a part of the official record. And so the defense can question you, assuming you're testifying for the prosecution. The opposing attorney can question you about whatever's in those notes, even if it's not pertaining to the question that the prosecutor asked you about. So you've got to be real careful about that, too.
So, if cop-looking guys left in my house and said we're going to take the servers because we need to.
Cop-looking guys?
That's what I do. Right, you know, I'm not going to get that badges.
They got guns?
I'm scared.
Then you probably shouldn't say no. I wouldn't. If they've got guns, no. And if they don't come in with a court order, they may not be cops. But if they've got guns, it's more important to stay alive than to stand up for the principle. So you always can go back and get an attorney and sue the city or the county or whatever. If they did make an illegal entry, then you could get rich that way. So you want to stay alive in order to get rich. I wouldn't say, no, you can't, and go get my rifle out of the closet.
Because most people want to cooperate with the authorities.
Right.
So,
And that is usually, well, the evidence, if they gain the evidence illegally, it'll be suppressed. It'll be thrown out of court. It won't. If you were charged with something based on that evidence and it was gotten illegally, the exclusionary rule determines that that's not even allowed to be introduced in court. Can't be used against you. So, like, you gave consent to the search, so they're going to claim it was a consent search. But if it was done under duress, then consent's not effective. So you still got protections there. Yeah, don't give consent. Don't tell them no, you can't, but don't say it's okay with me either. Most law enforcement agencies, their policies, they don't have to do this by law, but their policies usually dictate that they get consent in writing. Because you could always, if you did give consent, you could come back and say you didn't. So don't sign anything. That's always good general advice anyways.
And you can always leave and say, I want to talk to my attorney.
Sure. If you're being charged with something, you have, you've all seen on TV the Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. That's the first and foremost one. You have the right to an attorney. So you don't have to say anything or sign anything. I thought Mark told you about that yesterday. Don't do that either. No, now a state could pass a statute that would give, in some cases, broader authority to law enforcement, but if it violates constitutional rights, that statute would be held to be unconstitutional and it would be ineffective and your case would still be thrown out of court, even if the state created that statute. Like many years ago, when the state of Tennessee had the fleeing felon statute that said it was okay to shoot a fleeing felon even if they didn't pose any danger to anybody. In the Supreme Court case of Garner versus Tennessee, the Supreme Court said no, that's not right, even though it says that right there in the Tennessee statute. That violates the constitutional rights of those suspects. You can't do that. You have to have that person posing a danger to somebody. You have to have more of a reason than just the fact that they committed a felony and now they're running. Yes?
As an observation, the difference between soldiers and cops,
Yeah.
a soldier will pull the trigger.
Right.
A cop will stop and think about it and then say, what am I supposed to do now? The soldier says, die.
Then that's because the soldier is dealing with the enemy. The cop is dealing with the citizens of his own country, you know, who shouldn't be considered the enemy. Some cops do consider them that, but that's not the way it's supposed to work.
I saw that you used to be an instructor at a police academy.
Yes.
Most officers don't seem to have a high knowledge of a lot of computer crime or security-related things, but they need the knowledge to do the job. And as you said, they don't like not knowing.
That's right.
And at the same time, they don't necessarily want to hear it from you because they're just not overly friendly, or I don't know what it is.
Right.
But how would you, there's always a barrier, and you've already spoken to that. How would you go about, because they need to teach them what they need to know to do their job, and so it doesn't make my job more difficult later on. How would you go about trying to break down that barrier?
I think that the first step in doing that is to put at least some computer crimes training into the basic academy, because the recruits who are not cops yet haven't developed so much of that attitude yet. So if you give them some basic knowledge in the basic academy, rather than waiting like we do now in almost all cases until they're already police officers and they want to specialize in that, now they're cops and they have that cop attitude. It's sort of like get them young, start them out when they're embryo cops. Another thing that you can do, well, that was a common term I used in the academy. Another thing you can do is there are police officers who are interested in this, who, however they did it, got involved in using the net at home or whatever, and develop that, encourage that, make those people the experts so that they can be the ones to teach it to the other cops, because then the cops will give them credibility because they're one of us, so they must know something. But that's a good question, because it is a big barrier, and it's probably the most difficult one to overcome in trying to train police officers. You know. But it's lots of fun to work with rookies. It's not fun. Police academy instructors don't enjoy training in-service people. They do enjoy the rookies because they're still enthusiastic and they want to learn. They want to soak up everything they can about it. Okay. Oh, one last question. That's my husband. He just did that too.
Well, actually, if you got your, use the machine and you back into whatever hospital, and the authorities get a warrant to take the machine, and say you're running 2,000, whatever, and it's totally locked down. Do they have to get a warrant to break into it, or?
You mean would they have to have two separate warrants?
Do they have to have a warrant to? I mean, it's like you're not going to give them the password to get on. I mean, or is that? No, it's not necessary.
Right. The original warrant.
You don't need the password to where everything is on.
Oh no, not at all.
No, I mean, I know, but like, I'm just saying, if you have the thing, like, do they have to have a warrant to get the data off the machine?
Generally, the original warrant would be written in such a way to give them the authority to take that data, not just to physically seize the computer. You wouldn't need two different warrants. Usually, although a search warrant can be very specific as well. And in a case where, let me use another analogy, where you suspect someone of stealing television sets. Okay, when the police go in to search for that stolen property, they can't look in the jewelry box because that's not where a television set would be. So there are some restrictions, but when we get a warrant, we always try to get it written in as broad a way as possible. Because if we have the legal authority to search there, then we can use what we find as evidence. But if we don't have the legal authority to search in that place, we don't. So we want to get it broad, and usually the judge is gonna sign a warrant that's broad enough to give you that authority.